Hello, I'm Harley Schlanger, and I'm welcoming you to our weekly dialogue with Helga Zepp-LaRouche. Today is November 26, 2020. We're in the midst of a strategic situation that's crammed full of developments, some ominous, some can be expected given the breakdown of governments, the breakdown of the financial system. I think what we'll start with is the fight in the United States over the vote fraud case against President Trump, with a series of filings, legal filings, and developments over the last days. Helga, why don't you catch us up on what you have on that?
Well, it's again the question of perception and reality. If you would believe only the mainstream media, especially in Europe, um, especially in Germany, but also, I guess, in other countries, um, you get a picture, everything is lost. You have this crazy person who doesn't want to leave despite the fact that he has lost the election. But actually, if you look at the situation more as it really is, a quite different picture emerges. I think some people may have seen or heard of the hearing which took place yesterday in Gettysburg, quite meaningfully in Gettysburg, where the fight between the Union and the Confederacy was in a fierce battle, and that's about the same issue, because the Confederacy at the time was allied with the British Empire. Um, and that is the issue today. Will the efforts by the British Empire to first, you know, get rid of Trump with Russiagate, that didn't go anywhere. Then you had the impeachment, and now finally you have the vote fraud. So this is all one single operation, and President Trump is hanging in there. He appeared in this hearing, not in person. This was organized by some Republican state senators of Pennsylvania. And what happened was that they had uh, each senator made a short statement, and then they had several witnesses of people who would testify to all kinds of vote fraud. And I was just thinking while listening to some of these witnesses that there must be hundreds or probably thousands of people who have been complicit, because you cannot do such a ballot stuffing and keeping the Republican observers away and all kinds of things. I mean, there must have been really hundreds at least of Democrats who were condoning this kind of activity. So if it ever comes to a criminal suit, I think, when people have to say under oath if they collaborated in such a operation, it can really become an incredible story. But then at a certain point, and some of these witnesses really had unbelievable testimony about how votes disappeared, how what they observed, how their votes were basically not counted, did not appear on the ballots. I mean, all kinds of different stories. And then President Trump was connected by telephone, and he said that he will not give up because he knows for certain that there was election fraud, and that he's going to fight this out absolutely. Now, I think it's really important because with all this media confetti, people, at least outside of the United States, would have a very hard time to even understanding what is the issue. Is it just a stubborn Trump who is trying to cling to power? No, what is at stake here is an unbelievable story, and there is no question that there was vote fraud involving these voting machines from the Dominion and Smartmatic firm. I mean, I think that has been established pretty clear, because this was an issue, which even Elizabeth Warren and others had, Senator Klobuchar had already made a fuss about it much earlier, some years ago. So there is the question of that these machines can switch votes. Naturally, Sidney Powell who had made this very spectacular press conference, and then she was kicked out from the Giuliani defense team. I mean, she presented last night a suit. I was not yet able to read it. It's 180 pages long, and it is a challenge to the outcome of the election in Georgia. I think she she attacks there the governor and second person of having installed these machines deliberately in a hurry in 2019 for this vote fraud in 2020. So we have to see if she has the material to prove it. I mean, there's all kinds of psy-war, psychological warfare, disinformation, threats. When, for example, the head of the General Service Administration, Emily Murphy, when she finally moved this process so that the transition to Biden could start, that he would have access to information and get certain funds, this was everywhere reported as, this is now it. It's not it. She said that she did that because that's her job, and that she and her family were under immense threats, death threats. Also, Pat Lang in his blog said that he had received threats because he was still insisting that there was a vote fraud which had to be discovered. So the atmosphere of this whole thing is really unbelievable, and you have to really think, what is proven, what is what is going on, and what's going on is very clear, that it is the question: will there be honest election in the United States? If the United States is being turned into a banana republic, where a president can give a press conference and then is being shut up by the CEOs of the major TV stations, if his speech is being declared fake news, if Twitter and Facebook censor any information, which is not to their liking. I mean, this is a bigger story than just this election fight. This is the question of, what about democracy? What about Western values? Is there an honest and free election possible? And that has implications for the whole world. So I think I would really urge our viewers, that is you, to not, go with any fake news or any sense perception of what seems to be right, because on this battle depends much, much more than, who is the next president. It is a very fundamental question. Will the United States be again controlled by people who think they should run the world in an unipolar world as an empire, or will it be the chance to go to an alliance of sovereign nation states? And on that depends really the future of us all.
You mentioned this whole question of Smartmatic and Dominion, and we've had before that Klobuchar and Elizabeth Warren warned of fraud. In her suit, Sidney Powell also identifies that Stacey Abrams, who became the darling of the left Democrats when she ran for governor of Georgia in 2018, she protested back in 2019 about bringing in Smartmatic. So the idea that these machines can't be tampered and can't be subject to fraud, I think that's one of the key elements of the suit that was filed by Sidney Powell. Now, one of the things that was interesting to me is when President Trump called into the Gettysburg meeting, he said on the vote fraud, they got caught, just as they got caught when they spied on my campaign. Yesterday, he announced the pardon for General Flynn. And there is this parallel between the whole operation of the Russiagate story and the election fraud. And I wonder if you'd care to say something about that.
Well, remember that General Flynn was the one who had tried to, make Obama aware of US policies in the Middle East, supporting and giving weapons and money to Al-Qaeda and ISIS and so forth, which he opposed. And then Obama, used that occasion to put Flynn on a list when it was clear that Trump wanted to make him national security advisor. there was an effort by Obama to try to prevent that. And naturally, then there was the setup against Flynn by the intelligence community. And I think Flynn, I don't know much about him, but from what I know is that he opposed this whole endless wars policy. He opposed many of the policies, and he knows, a lot of things which really were done wrongly by the intelligence community. So I think this is very important, and I think that if President Trump said that this man should never have been indicted, and that he was completely innocent, I think that from everything I can see, this is absolutely true. And that brings up naturally the question that President Trump should really exonerate my late husband, Lyndon LaRouche, because if you can say that he was completely innocent, then about Flynn, then that can be said a million times about Lyndon LaRouche. So I think President Trump would do very well to, pardon my husband. Not that he needs it. He's exonerated in front of the world through his writings and his incredible life work. But I think it would be an act of justice to do exactly that.
Now, one of the things you've been emphasizing is the intent both behind Russiagate and the vote fraud, that is to remove President Trump for a return to the geopolitical doctrines, the neoliberal policies of the Bush and Obama era. Look what we're seeing with the Biden team that's being brought in. This is precisely the direction, maybe even worse than we had with Obama coming up, isn't it?
Well, I think this forebodes nothing good. I mean, it's not yet settled that Biden will come in, because it obviously depends on the outcome of this legal battle now. But if you look at the appointees and the policies, now, first of all, John Kerry is supposed to become the new climate czar, pushing through the Green New Deal, the reinstalling the Paris Climate Accord. I mean, that would mean that you had the European Union, the EU Commission, and the United States going for this Green New Deal policy, which is, it's just inconceivable. Asia right now is advancing. They're betting on high technology, on high energy flux densities, on nuclear energy, on thermonuclear fusion. And I think if Europe and the United States continue with this green policy, they don't need to fear China or Asia in a systemic competition, because they are getting rid of themselves all by themselves. Because the green policy means you will not have industrial nations, and the population potential of a decarbonized economy is just extremely low. And if the whole world would submit to that, you would go down to a population of about 1 billion. Now, fortunately, there are large parts of the world which are not going in this direction. The countries working with China, the countries associated with the Belt and Road Initiative. So I think that it is not going to be a fully decarbonized world, but Europe and the United States would destroy themselves. Now, if you look at the supposed new defense secretary, this Michel Flournoy, I mean, there is a lot of, brouhaha about that this would be the first woman in the job of being a defense secretary. I think this is pretty irrelevant, because she is completely identical with the military-industrial complex. Her entire career was to be, sort of going back and forth between the Pentagon and the military producers. She was one of the co-founders of something called the Center for a New American Security, CNAS. That's a complete military-industrial complex kind of think tank. And she was in favor of all the wars, Iraq, Afghanistan, Syria, Libya. So, this forebodes nothing good for the continuation of the geopolitical confrontation the United States would have with Biden. And then you have this Avril Avril Haines, who is mooted to be the new National Intelligence Director, overseeing 17 intelligence agencies. She was the person who was the legal advisor for Obama's military drones. You remember that Obama every Tuesday had a meeting in the Oval Office where he would make a list of people who would be killed with drones. So this Avril Haines was the person who had to make that list and find the legal arguments to do so. So this is really not a good thing at all. And people who say it's good that the United States goes back to normal, they really should think what this normal means. It means endless wars. It means interventionist wars, and confrontation, escalation of confrontation with Russia and China. So I think this is not a good normal at all.
And one of Flournoy's collaborators is Tony Blinken, who was named already by Biden to be Secretary of State. Blinken has not only been for every war, but he was calling for taking back Crimea, sending more troops to Afghanistan when the president is calling for pulling troops back. And Blinken and Flournoy were partners in something called West Exec, which was a firm that was getting contracts from the Pentagon for military contractors. So it's the military industrial complex straight up. Now, while we're talking about this, look, on the strategic situation, there are some very grave concerns. One has to do with the Robert O'Brien doing a tour of Asia. Now he's in the Philippines, but also this Economist article about the British reasserting their right to be in the Indo-Pacific. This ought to send up alarms all over Asia.
Yes, the defense minister of the Philippines, Lorenzana, he said if there is a war between the US and China, and that could happen any moment because of the absolute increased tensions around the South China Sea, naturally also around Taiwan, the Philippines would be in it if they want or not. Now, I find it very alarming that he says there could be a war any minute, because I think that is the reality. And if you look also at the provocations around the port of Vladivostok, where US military ships basically crossed the line, which is regarded by Russia as Russian territory in the sea, we are sitting on a powder keg, and this idea which you mentioned concerning the British going back to the east of Suez policy as it was until 68, really is coincident with this whole expansion of NATO to make NATO global, to expand NATO into the Indo-Pacific, to set up a new headquarters there. And that is all designed for the encirclement of Russia and China. And this can have no good end, because you cannot contain a country of 1.4 billion people and think that you can stop the rise of a country which is set to grow, put everything on innovation. And this is a policy which will lead eventually to World War III. I think that the German defense minister, AKK, Annegret Kramp-Karrenbauer, I mean, she is, I have no idea what's going on with this woman. She sends a frigate from the Bundeswehr, from the German Navy, to the Pacific to contain China. I mean, that's just completely crazy. And I think we should really oppose this. We need an absolute different approach. And I think, therefore, it is very important that President Putin reiterated his call to have a summit of the permanent 5 members of the UN Security Council. Now, he made that proposal in January of this year, and he said it should happen as soon as the COVID pandemic allows for it to occur. Now that is now on the horizon with vaccines available. And I think it would be very important that this summit takes place before January 20th to change the dynamic, because I think with Biden, you can forget it. There will be never a new Bretton Woods system. There will be never a new security architecture. And with Trump, despite the fact that he unfortunately has gone on this anti-China rampage since the 18th of April, actually, when he started to accuse China of being behind the spread of the coronavirus, that was probably the single most strategic blunder of this year, because the solution to all problems in the world largely depends on the United States and China working together. The two strongest economies must collaborate to defeat the pandemic, to overcome the financial crisis, to overcome the underdevelopment of the developing sector. And if the two countries are at odds, World War III is almost a given. And therefore, such a summit to really change the strategic situation before January 20th, no matter what happens after that, I think is an absolute urgent matter.
And just to go back to this east of Suez perspective again with the British, it's very interesting that the British are assuming that if Biden comes in, the special relationship will be back in place, because there's no way, with the wreck of the economy that's going on in the United Kingdom, they have a capability to extend their armed forces into the Indo-Pacific. I think it was today the Chancellor of the Exchequer announced that the English economy is in the worst collapse in 300 years. And that brings up the whole question of where we stand from the financial system, the systemic crisis underway.
Well, we know what the what the financial establishment intends to do. They want to have the Great Reset, meaning, that's the sort of the label for the supposed restarting the economy after the pandemic. But that is really not the issue, because the financial system was bankrupt long before Corona started to be a subject. And the problem is that after 2008, which was a systemic crisis where the system was already finished, they started to pump money without end, accumulating such a mountain of debt that it's completely unpayable. So the Great Reset means that with the trick of the digitalization of the currencies, they want to just establish a financial dictatorship. And once you have eliminated cash, once you have electronic money only, then naturally you can inflate the debt away. That would be a modern way of doing exactly what happened in 1923, when inflation and eventually hyperinflation ate away the debt. It means the de facto devaluation of the life work of many people. But that is unfortunately what the plan is, and to also eliminate the savings and loans banks, the commercial banks, and basically have then a total control over the financial system, which I think is the real danger here, because these are the policies of Hjalmar Schacht and everything which goes with that.
Now, you mentioned the so-called end of the COVID crisis, which the British are counting on, but we have seen the effect of the Operation Warp Speed in developing the vaccine. On the other side of that, we're seeing the collapse of what some people were holding up as the solution, the so-called herd immunity. I mean, what's actually happening in Sweden? And even worse, what are we hearing now coming out of Switzerland?
Well, I think right now the Swedish story must be made known. Our colleagues in Sweden are working on putting it together. And this Swedish model, which was held up so big, that this was the much better way than lockdowns and much better way of just going for herd immunity. Now it's becoming known that what they did is they just let the old people die in the nursing homes. They never even tried to treat them. by just giving them palliative medication, to take the pain away and let them die. I mean, this is really very, very close to what happened, with the useless eaters approach by the Nazis. And this whole discussion is coming back. I mean, look, in Switzerland, as you mentioned, and Switzerland is one of the richest countries on the planet. They have not enough medical facilities, hospital beds, and they are openly discussing the need to have triage. The same is now again coming back in Italy, because the Italian government did nothing to increase the hospital beds, especially the intensive care units, so that the doctors in Milan said that what they are forced to do right now is not acceptable, neither from a clinical point of view nor from an ethical point of view. And in Germany, there is a real propaganda to convince people, well, that it's better not to live too long, because it's all covered under this idea that you have to have control over your own life, to die with dignity. Well, the German Constitutional Court, and we sort of not paid enough attention to that, already in February had a ruling which gives everybody the right to have assisted suicide, even if you are healthy, even if you are very young. And this was now the basis of a movie which was in German TV this past Monday. The title of it was God, and it was based on a model of one of the bestseller authors from Germany, von Schirach. This is a story of a 70-year-old man whose wife died, and he doesn't want to live on despite the fact that he is healthy. And then, this was all this story around this case. And they made a poll while the movie was playing, and 70.8% of the people watching this voted that this should be allowed, that there should be assisted suicide if people wanted to end their life. Now, that, I mean, one of the organizations I founded many years ago was the Club of Life, which was countered against the Club of Rome, because this was, I created this in 82, because at that time this propaganda started really badly, and if you have people who are old and feeble, and they feel that they are dependent on their children, and then there's pressure that if you have too much medical treatment, then it will take away from the heritage. So you can convince old people that it's more human and more nice if they just agree to die. This is a social pressure, and we discussed this in many campaigns, because we said once you start discussing that under conditions of crisis, it's the slippery slope which was discussed in Nuremberg. If you remember, in Nuremberg, they discussed that, how did euthanasia become possible? And the discussion was that in the beginning, it was just a tiny change in the value of life. But then once you start this slippery slope and the crisis comes, then, once you have an environment where people, have lost the moral compass, and the idea of unworthy life becomes, an economic pressure, then you end up where we were in Germany 80 years ago. So, I can only say this is very dangerous, because the individual life is precious. And even if people dislike what I'm saying now, I think people should take a lesson from President Xi Jinping and President Putin, who both have emphasized in their fight against the pandemic that they try to protect every single life, because life is the most important. And you can tell the moral fiber of a country is how they treat that question. So I can only warn against this, because in Germany we had the experience how this happened 80 years ago, or longer actually, but in the Nazi period. And while it comes along with a modern dress, it's the same thing. like Ezekiel, Ezekiel Emmanuel, the new advisor of Biden, who we know from the Obama period, who made this incredible analysis like a health economist that since most of the cost in a patient's life is the last half year, well, it's better let people just die and don't waste all of this money because they're going to die anyway. And once you have that attitude, you open the door to exactly what happened with the Nazis in Germany. So I can only warn against that in the strongest terms.
And Emmanuel is on the Biden, assuming Biden gets in, if he does. Emmanuel is slated to join his COVID task force, someone who says no one should live past 75. Now, finally, Helga, we have coming up a couple of events that will be online, conferences people can attend. One will be the International Investigative Committee on the U.S. Elections, which will be this Saturday starting at, I think, noon Eastern Time on the schillerinstitute.com website. And then we have the International Conference on the 12th and the 13th. And we just have a minute or two, if you can just summarize what you think is the significance of this conference coming up on the 12th and 13th.
Well, anybody who wants to know what are the details and the present level of knowledge around this US election fight should tune in on Saturday. That procedure, the investigation and the judgment and then analysis of that will go into the Schiller Conference on the 12th. But the general subject of this upcoming Schiller Conference on December 12th and 13th will be the question of the coincidence of opposites. This is the question of how do you develop a method of thinking where you are not stuck with your sensuous experience or your sense certainty. This is very important because if you go by sense certainty in the US election fight and the fraud fight, you end up with the wrong answer. You have to approach it from a higher standpoint. You have to approach the strategic situation from a higher standpoint. You have to develop that thinking of the one humanity which is above the national interest. Otherwise, you end up in a geopolitical confrontation. And that will be discussed in terms of the military strategy, the economic issues, and then there will be a whole panel on the committee of the coincidence of opposites, which will be the effort to initiate a gigantic aid organization to help the developing countries, especially Africa, which is right now in a very dangerous crisis because of COVID, because of the famine, and try to get an alliance of people from all walks of life to change the policy, go for medical supplies, go for shipment of food on an emergency basis, but then at the same time start the industrialization of the developing countries for earnest, because that is the only protection against future epidemics and future famines. And then finally, we will have a beautiful celebration of the year of Beethoven, because this conference takes place just 3-4 days before the actual birthday of Beethoven's, the 250th birthday. And the subject will be to think like Beethoven. We will have the contribution of music, of young people who work on classical culture. And that will be, the way how to find a refuge and find the inner strength to deal with this incredibly difficult period, only in classical art and classical music. So you should definitely mark that date and participate actively. If you register, you can participate with questions and be informed about all the details. So I would really urge you to be part of that conference, because that will be a very important inflection point where the world must go with all these dangers we just touched upon.
And you can find the invitation and other material on these conferences on the schillerinstitute.com website. Helga, thanks for joining us again this week, and we'll see you again next week.
Till next week.